We got John from Texas who is calling in to Truth Wanted. John, you're live on the show. What's up?
Hello, gentlemen. How are you doing?
Doing okay. How about yourself, John?
I'm doing well, thank you. So today I'm just calling up. I wanted to put a scenario to you guys and see how you would answer.
Okay. All right.
There's a delay. So the scenario basically is this. Let's just say, for example, you're in a park and I'm in a park and we meet up. And I say to you that I'm an agnostic. I'm 50-50 between two propositions. The proposition God exists and its negation that God does not exist. And I'm 50-50. I don't feel I have any reason to believe one is more likely true than the other, or I've heard reasons either way and I feel they cancel themselves out. But either case, I'm 50-50 between those two propositions. And I ask you, gentlemen, are you 50-50 or do you lean one way more than the other, as one proposition being more likely true than the other? And what reason would you give to justify leaning one way more than the other?
Okay. I'm assuming, John, you're talking about the God of Christianity, like the God of the Bible. Like, just want to clarify that first.
Well, shall I just give a couple of definitions of God, just so I clarify the meaning?
I mean, I guess so, sure.
Yeah, so I would define it this way. So I'll give two definitions, and you can either accept both of them, because I accept both of them, or just accept one of them, or we'll work from there. So my first definition would be that when I say the proposition God exists, what I'm saying is ultimate reality is personal in nature instead of being impersonal. So personal in nature, I don't mean relational. I mean like the fundamental forces of ultimate reality are aware and intentional. Whereas the proposition God does not exist would ultimate reality is impersonal in nature. So its fundamental forces of reality would be unaware, unguided, unintended. And the second definition maybe you want to go with God would just be a being that didn't come into existence, which is the ultimate cause for all things that did come into existence. Now, I would accept both of them, but you could accept one or the other. So I would say do you lean towards one of those propositions being more likely true than the other, or would you say you're 50-50? But if you do lean more towards one being true, what reason do you think you have to justify that?
Well, I'll start with this, and then I'll give my answer. Then I want to hear Calvin's answer, I think, is how we'll do it. So if there is a God, I don't think that he's very personal in nature, right? Like there just doesn't seem to be any particular reason to believe that there is a God that personally interacts with human beings. I think every person that's ever talked about experience with God is pretty much suspect, right? I don't think that there's very good reason for that. But let's say that it's a God that is maybe personal, maybe continues to work in the world, but doesn't interact with human beings. Okay, well, again, I'd say that we don't have a lot of evidence for that. You know, like when you talk to people who study this stuff for a living, chemists, astronomers, people who are looking at anything that involves deep time, even, it seems that all the processes that we've come to so far, we further and further are able to explain through naturalism. Are we able to explain everything so far? No, not yet. But like, there doesn't need to be an intervention from a supernatural force to really talk about most of the things that we have observed in the universe. And when I think of a God, I think of a God that interacts with my universe, interacts with me locally, interacts with the stuff that I see, with the trees and the birds and the people. And there doesn't seem to be any reason to go that route. So if there is a God, I would think that he had to be impersonal. You know, like there was a part of me that kind of leaned deist at one point, because I thought maybe that there is some sort of creator or being out there. But even then, I'm not even sure how I would define that, let alone what that means as far as their interaction with our universe. So I think that would be my response. But Calvin, you know, what would you say to this?
Yeah, so I guess I would agree with you, first of all, is that I don't think if there was any God out there, it either one, doesn't want me to know that it exists, or two, doesn't exist. And so far I see no evidence to, you know, of the latter, that it does exist. You know, everything that I see throughout the world is, you know, natural. I don't see any reason to suppose that a God created anything that I see in the world today.
So there you go.
Okay, could I Could I interact with that? Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. I would say, first of all, just to clarify, when I use the word personal, I think you're using the term how I would use the term relational. So when I was saying personal, I just mean, because in philosophy, if you say being, it could a rock could be a being, a platonic object could be a being. It's just that when I say personal, I just mean it has the qualities of what we would think of like a human being. You know, I'm aware, I have intention and guidance. You're thinking more how I would think relational, which is he wants to have a relationship with people. But anyway, you guys, this is what I basically heard. There's no evidence to believe the proposition God exists, but that's not evidence to believe the proposition that he does not exist unless, so you wouldn't have a justification to be more than 50-50 either way, unless your argument is the absence of evidence is leading to the evidence of absence, which is in some circumstances, that's a proper inference. There's three categories of inference you can have. I'm somebody who studies belief forming mechanisms a lot and works with computer science and very interested in AI and things. So, but the thing is, I would say this, like we could get into what that evidence is, and if you think it leads to evidence of absence, but for example, you guys brought up that some people believe in the flat Earth, and you think it's silly. And I expect you would think that there's a lot of good reasons to believe in the spherical Earth. Well, the funny thing is, atheism itself is an anomaly, pretty much an anomaly of time in history, an anomaly of a small amount of people in a certain part of the world. And most of the people believed in deity, and just like most of the people now believe the world is spherical. And to say there's not enough evidence, well, the vast majority of people must believe there's enough good reason because they believe it. So to say that God hasn't left enough evidence is to me a bit of a strange one if most of the world does believe in deity. But I would just press on this point. Are you guys saying that in this case, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence? That's why you're justified to believe the proposition God does not exist is more likely? Or are you not saying that?
So 2 to 3 things to respond here. First, when you clarify in your definition of personal, when you said that God, what you really mean isn't relational, what you're saying is it's something that has intention, basically has these human-like qualities. I would still argue and say that I don't believe there's enough evidence that there's a God that expresses human-like qualities for the same reasons that I said before. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason to believe that there's a God with human-like qualities any more than there's a God with rabbit-like qualities or a God with any of these other qualities. I don't know if a God exists, what his personality would be like or what his intentions would be like, because it doesn't, it doesn't compute with me. I haven't even gotten to the God part yet. Moving on to your other points, I would say, yes, atheism as its modern understanding is a thing of its time. It definitely has an epoch, right? It's definitely not the norm for most of human history, and it's not even the norm today. I mean, it's still just a pocket of the world that really comes to this conclusion. But I also don't understand why that's relevant, because like quantum physics was also a pretty new thing, and most people didn't have an understanding of physics that involved quantum mechanics, but that doesn't discount the reality of like quantum mechanics. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. My belief isn't going to be based on popular consensus unless it involves academics. In which case, again, like just because, a lot of people believe in the flat Earth before or didn't believe in a spherical Earth, they didn't have any, their reasoning was suspect. They just didn't have the tools that we have now to come to the conclusion that the Earth was spherical. And maybe we don't have the tools right now to come to the conclusion that there is a God that has created everything. But again, I would say, we don't have the tools to do that. So if I don't have the tools to do that, so then it's not good for me to just come to the conclusion and say, oh yeah, there must be a God. Because again, there isn't enough evidence to lead me there. And I would also further point out that, a lot of people believe in a God, but not all of it's the Christian God. And certainly even within the Christian, belief, there's different ideas about what God is. Is he a Trinity? Is he, in space and time? Is he outside of space and time? I mean, Christians at different points of time have believed in all kinds of stuff, and none of it had to do with like observations of the outside world, at least most of it. It just had to do with, I don't know, what people believed at the time. So I don't know I hope I'm answering your question. But I guess like the absence of evidence is kind of like the axiom that I'm accepting, I guess, at this point in time, because again, like, I don't know what tools we would even use to conclude that a God is there, and if there were something to get us there, then yeah, I couldn't comprehend that right now.
Yeah, I kind of look at it as.
Yeah.
I'll let Calvin respond here.
Yeah, I kind of look at it as the lack of evidence of water in my cup is evidence that there is no water in my cup. So, you know, in this case, I would say that the lack of evidence, you know, yes, I would agree with you. Kind of slipping at my wordage, but yeah. And then my next thing would be, is this God, how are you so sure that it is your God, you know, that you're talking about? How do you know that it's not the God of Hinduism or, you know, any other religion? How did you rule out all these other gods and, you know, come down that it has to be this one?
Yeah. Okay. I'll answer that. I just want to respond to a couple of, well, you said a few things. I won't take up too much time, but one of the things I will just say is, when you were talking about lack of evidence and you were saying about the quantum physics example and things like that, well, that's different, because I don't think anyone was believing the proposition against quantum physics. They just didn't believe in the proposition for it. But with this one, you're believing in the proposition against it. But the issue is, my reason for giving the evidence is just that your first premise was, if God existed, we would expect to see evidence of him because he would be relational. We don't. And I'm saying, well, if the vast majority of humanity did think they saw enough, then it's good evidence that he did leave that evidence. If the vast majority of humans' belief-forming and assessing mechanisms are concluded within them there's deity, then that to me would be that there's a good evidence for relational God.
Yeah.
Well, anyway,
if you ask most people if they've ever experienced God or the Christian God, I would say no. I think if you ask most of humanity if they've experienced Christian God, they wouldn't say that. You know?
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm talking about the general concept of deity. So I can't really see. Well, your example of the water in the cup, yeah, that's good, because that's you have evidence that there's no water in the cup, because you'd expect to see it if there was. So the absence of what you're seeing is the evidence. So I can't really see. I don't see this absence of evidence for God is number one justified, because most of the people believe there's enough reason to believe in God. And number two, it just doesn't seem powerful enough to get you off the 50-50 mark. Like, I think if you were to be intellectually honest, you'd have to say, well, I'm 50-50 on the belief God so far, what you presented. In terms of why I believe in God, my God, I have many reasons. A lot of them are non-inferential and a lot of them are inferential. I became a Christian when I was 17 because I had an experience of God, a spiritual experience of God. And then what happened, I had confirmation with things that I couldn't have brought about that happened along them. Now, I don't get these things all the time. I've had them, maybe I can count them on one hand. But they particularly happened to me at the beginning of when I became a Christian at 17, and I committed myself to following God after that. But that's how I would say one way. But there's lots of ways. That's a non-inferential way, because it was directly by experience. I didn't infer it. I didn't come and rationally have premises and conclude to it. It was just direct. So I would say I'm justified on that position. And then the absence of a defeater. In philosophy, there's two types of defeaters. You've got a rebutting defeater, or you've got undercutting defeater, and I don't think any of this. So, so you guys would hang your hat just on the fact that you think that the proposition God exists doesn't have any evidence, and that expected evidence doesn't have enough expected evidence, or the amount of evidence or the type of evidence that you would expect. So it brings you to go to believe the proposition God does not exist. Is that basically it?
I mean, yeah. When you talk about, when we propose that the Earth is a sphere rather than flat, there are things we would expect if it's a sphere or spheroid, right? You're talking about a personal God, even as you've defined it here. Like, again, not a relational God, just a personal God. I don't know what to expect with that. And I don't know that whatever those expectations are, if we've met that. Again, like Christianity and even God experiences, I would not say, I think your definition is too broad in that most people believe in a God when you say that people have had experiences. Because I don't think we can actually know that for sure. And also we're talking about, at least for modern religious conceptions, those are only a few thousand years old. Humanity has been around for hundreds of thousands of years, if we're talking about Homo sapiens. And I don't know if all of those people have had God experiences the same way that we talk about our God experiences. And then even then, if we say that, oh, well, we're relying on these experiences to justify our beliefs, if we just relied on my personal experience, I would say the earth is flat, because I look out and I see, well, yeah, that's what I see, and everybody else around me, that's what they see too. So then we can come to that conclusion. But that's not a good way of coming to truth. Again, like, consensus on truth doesn't come from just a democracy of people's personal experiences. It has to come from other outside evidences, and again, proposal of models of what we can expect to see. And I think that religious experiences, particularly personal experiences that we talk about when we sing that we mean God or we meet the supernatural, can be explained by natural brain states that can be naturally induced, secularly induced, that have not really anything to do with anything supernatural. And I say this as someone who was a Christian and who also cited personal experience as my basis for knowing that God was real. You know, like that was also my sort of epistemology there. But I came to the conclusion that, well, there's a lot of people that come to different conclusions based off of their personal experiences. And that's probably because there's culture that impacts your personal experiences. There's your surroundings, your background, all kinds of things that can influence how those experiences actually go. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying anything true about reality when we have those experiences. So I know that's a lot, John, but that's what I would say to that.
It's not a lot. I don't really see if it justifies leaning towards a proposition God does not exist. So, for example, you said, I don't know what the criteria would be to fulfill it. Well, that would mean you can't by the belief God does not exist, because you need a criteria to fill it one way or the other. So you'd have to say 50-50. In terms of looking at the flat Earth, you say our eyesight tells us.
I don't think it has to be 50-50. Can we talk about that? Like I don't know, like invisible. If you say invisible pink unicorns exist, and I would say I don't even know what it means to be an invisible pink unicorn. That doesn't mean, well, it's actually 50-50 then, because we don't know how to define that.
Well,
it
is 50. Well, I would say it's not true because it's a contradiction in terms, but in terms of if you just said unicorns exist, for example. Because basically it works like this. So I want to get back to some of your points, and I don't want to just spew on you all this stuff about philosophy and stuff. But just to start with this, so logicians use symbols in logic, and that's to negate bias. So, for example, you can, based on the excluded law, logical law of excluded nil, you can only have a proposition and its negation. There's no in between. So you have the proposition P and its negation not P, right? And that's true of any set of propositions. So if I was to give you the proposition the stars in the universe are even in number, the only other possible one would be they're uneven in number, and that would be its proposition and its negation. There's no in between. Yeah. So. What you do is when you start with P or not P, you have to start 50-50 before any context is added to those propositions. You start with those symbols, P and not P. You have to start 50-50 on the fact that they're the only two logical possibilities. So then the reason to believe one of them more than the other is wholly dependent on the context of what you put into those propositions. So if you're going to believe whatever proposition I put into those logical symbols, it's going to have to be some reason. Now, let's say we have the proposition, again, the stars are even in number and they're uneven in number. Well, people will say I haven't got evidence either way, they're 50-50. But let's say we say, unicorns or not. People have a lot of background beliefs that they think make unicorns less likely to exist than exist, things they would expect to see, or they think, well, the only reason we have it is because someone invented it, and the likelihood of it just occurring by chance, because if it was made of matter, and the likelihood of that morphology occurring by chance is less likely than likely. So they have a load of inferences they have. So that's why they don't believe it, because of their background beliefs. But if I'm questioning them, I'm questioning what are those background beliefs, okay? So we can get to what it is they're inferring from. And in terms of the flat Earth, so I'll go back to flat Earth. You say, okay, it looks flat. Well, then you'd be justified to believe it's flat. Now, because it's a non-inferential basic belief, you are justified to believe the things that your belief-forming mechanisms testify to you. Like, it looks like I'm in a room. I'm justified to believe that. In the absence of a defeater. Now, there's two types of defeaters. There's a undercutting defeater. That's where you have beliefs to believe that your belief-forming mechanisms are unreliable. For example, I keep feeling someone touching the back of my neck, let's say. I'm justified to believe that. But then I remember, I took medication. And one of the side effects is I get a feeling of someone touching the back of my neck. I have an undercutting defeater to that experience, to tell me that experience is unreliable at forming true beliefs. And then you've got something called a rebutting defeater, and that's just where you have good reasons to believe the opposite proposition, and those reasons become more powerful than the reasons to believe your original proposition, and so they defeat them. And they're your two types of defeaters. There isn't any other type of defeater. So if you believe the earth was flat because your eyes told you, you're justified. But then you get good evidence for a rebutting defeater from other types of belief form mechanisms to tell you it's sphere. So you defeat it. That's simply what's happening there. In terms of what you said with my brain states, you said, well, I can induce the God feeling. Yeah, you can induce a lot of things with brain states. I can induce you to see hallucinations. It doesn't mean you don't trust your eyes. It doesn't mean that your experience of sight is an unreliable belief forming mechanism. And the experience of God doesn't mean the experience of God is an unreliable belief forming mechanism just because I can induce it. I could say a lot more. I don't want to go on. I know you've probably got other callers, but I just want to see if you have a solid reason to be more than 50-50. To say, okay, I've got good reason to...
You have proposed a very specific model of justified true beliefs and justified beliefs, and I will say that obviously in the field of epistemology, there is no consensus on what it means to have a justified true belief, or if even a justified true belief is even what we should be shooting for. I'm putting that out as a disclaimer, but following your propositions, right? Do we have a defeater for God? I mean, yes, again, going back to it does depend on the specific God claims, right? Like, I thought it was interesting that you brought up multiple definitions of God, because that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know why we would talk about multiple definitions. If God does exist, he has a singular definition. I don't know unless there's a concept of God that can contain multiple definitions, I suppose, but I don't think that's necessarily what you're proposing. Like, if we're talking about matter, there's a definition of matter. There's not going to be two things of matter that we're looking at. But, besides all this, right, if you were to give me a specific God proposition, then yeah, I guess I could offer a defeater for it, like, or even like, a defeater being like, what would be an inference that, as you have made as an example, that would go against that, like somebody claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, for example. No, I have never seen any evidence of anybody rising from the dead besides like CPR patients, or defibrillator patients. But that's not how Jesus was described as rising from the dead, right? He's literally dead.
Them as dead.
Yeah, he literally dead for 3 days and then rose back. Okay, well, I've never seen that happen. So, like, I don't have good reason to believe that other than what a person says that. So, okay, have I ever seen a God create anything, or a God actually move in the universe? Have you ever actually seen matter come out of nowhere? Or have I seen something that could only be explained by miracles? No. And because we know that religious experiences can be induced from, again, completely secular means, having nothing to do with any divine rituals, or any kind of things that would allege to the existence of a God, then religious experiences can't be good evidence for me. They can't be good ways to rely on something being true. It has to be more than that. That's why I do raise that criteria to be a bit higher. And some people would say, well, Dan, that's unfair. And I would say, no, it's not. Because if you're actually claiming that God created the universe or interacts with people in the universe, like, we have to see something that's more than just, well, I felt something one time. That can't be all that we have, because people feel a lot of things at a lot of different times. I mean, there's Q people that have said that they can hear the voices of Q and hear the voice, like literally hear the voices of people that are talking to them and stuff. And like, that's obviously not something that we want to base our lives around. We want to be able to base our lives around as much good evidence as possible. And I don't see enough for any particular God claim, especially that of the Christian God. I think you can also point to it being a specific cultural point in history is also a defeater against it in a way. It doesn't make sense that God would suddenly reveal himself again in Israel like 2,000 years ago, as opposed to humanity, being around for as long as it has. But again, that goes into theology and other stuff that I can't argue here. But man, we have talked about this call for a long time. I'm sorry, John.
Yeah, we've been on here for a minute.
I really I do feel bad because I don't want to be the guy that talks and then doesn't let you talk. But like, we've been at it for a while. We got to move on with this one. But John, I do appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Yeah, and giving your take on that. It was, it was a lot, but Calvin, I actually appreciate that he fully explained what he meant.
Yeah.
Even if I completely disagreed with him, not completely, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I feel like he was kind of tripping over himself a couple times. But I mean, he did a good job trying to explain what he was talking about. And so, I mean, we can get some more calls like that. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, and I know I was talking a lot in that too, Calvin. But like, I think a thought out answer needs a thought out response.
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean, you looked like you were handling it, so I was letting you have it because you looked like
Well,
you had the wheel. So
I gotta I think this is like where I was at, and I don't want to project myself on John or anything, but it's like I thought personal experience was the best argument for God, and that's what I used for myself. But it just doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. Like it's not reliable, and it's not something that I think we should use when determining, especially a personal God.
right.
Especially,
Although it may be convincing to you, that doesn't mean that it's convincing to literally anyone else.
yeah, it's not available publicly. We need public evidence, I think.
Public evidence.
Yeah, seriously. We need evidence that's available to everyone, not just available to particular individuals. Like I truly think that's how that works, right?
Yeah. So why are you revealing yourself to just me? Let's reveal ourselves to everybody. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.